A few years ago, I had the privilege of spending Shabbos in the beautiful city, beginning of the more northern part of Israel, called Netanya. It's Asaf doesn't think it's a beautiful city. I think it's great. It's a beautiful beach city. Everyone's welcome to check it out and come up with their own conclusions. And I was staying on the 9th floor of a building, which was beautiful because then you actually have the full view. And what was even more beautiful than that was that our meals were not in this apartment. It was actually in a building a few blocks over on the 19th floor. So if you think the 9th floor is great, this was like stunning. The only issue with that was that aside from special elevators that are engineered in a specific way, Orthodox Jews, Shabbos observant Jews, do not take elevators on Shabbos. So you can just imagine, going to our apartment and then down the 9 flights of stairs, walking a few blocks over, going up 19 flights of stairs, coming down. We did this several times over Shabbos. Once I think was actually a mistake because we were looking for a host. We came up, we're like, no, he's down. So we went back down again. And we had a great time. And you can only imagine at the end of Shabbos, we were both we were drained and exhausted. And we actually realized that we need to start getting good workouts. And the only good thing about that whole experience was that we were very happy and felt good inside that we had observed our day of national rest. So there's like something a little bit funny about that. Like, what is all this talk about rest when, an experience like that is anything but rest? And it's like you see these kind of these things in Judaism where they take a concept that should be pretty simple, like, just chill, have a day of rest. And then like has anyone ever been to a Jewish New Year's party? Where everyone gets together and stands and prays for the entire day. I was like, yay, New Year's! And then we're like, oh my gosh, I'm exhausted, give me a day of rest. And you're climbing up the stairs. So why can't we just get these things straight? Why can't a day of rest be just chilling, going through your Facebook, watching some sports, taking the elevator, obviously. So that is what I want to address. And before I do that, I'm going to ask a question that will seem slightly not related, but hopefully it'll all tie in. And in order to remind myself to tie it in, I'll try to find somewhere on this board to put the question up so that it'll serve. Really? Yeah. I'll keep the menorah and the Magen David. Where's the eraser?
There's an eraser.
Oh, okay, a little bit of a hike.
Hold on
one second. Let me take a picture.
Anyways, so Jews love eating. And part of what we do to help ourselves continue to appreciate eating is that we take a few days throughout the year and we actually don't eat. It's very hard for us. The Muslims do it for 40 days. We're just like, 40 days? You're for sure cheating. No, we just don't eat. So one of those days is called the day of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. And it is a day where we commemorate the destruction of the temple. Thank you. And we don't eat on that day. It's one of the serious fast days up there with Yom Kippur. But unlike Yom Kippur, if Yom Kippur falls out on a Shabbat, on the Sabbath, we totally ignore the Sabbath almost entirely, and we fast and we don't do anything. But if Tisha B'Av falls out on Shabbat, we just ignore Tisha B'Av. We just do as if it's not there. We eat, we sing, we have a nice time. So what is the difference between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, where in one we ignore Shabbos, another one, Shabbos just overruns the entire thing? And you might say, okay, Yom Kippur, if whatever. I might say, okay, Yom Kippur is biblical. Tisha B'Av happened years later when there was the destruction of the temple. So maybe that's the difference. But we find actually with another fast day, which is considered much less severe than Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which is the fast day of the 10th of Tevet. We basically covered almost all of them. So if that were to fall out on Shabbat, we would actually do the same thing we did with Yom Kippur. We would ignore Shabbat and we would fast. It happens to be in the Jewish calendar the way it's run today. It cannot happen, but were it to happen, that's how we would treat it. So what is it about the 9th of Av that it does not override Shabbat and we feast and drink and sing? So I'll just write it down because I might forget it. So why 9th of Av is ignored on Shabbat. Okay. So, to actually that better, we will try to get a better understanding of what Shabbat is all about, and then I think it'll become actually obvious. So I somewhat miscounted the amount of prints. It's going to be close, but if not, then I do apologize, and please try to share it with the person sitting next to you. So I'm going to start with source A, which is actually in the Ten Commandments, and that is the source for observing Shabbos. The source that Rabbi Garfinkel brought at the beginning was when Shabbos first appears in the Torah, which is when God rested on the seventh day. But when the Jewish people are actually told for the first time that this is something they should be keeping is in the Ten Commandments. And the fact that it's in the Ten Commandments is telling, because the Ten Commandments are not just a list of random mitzvahs. To make it into that special group of 10, you have to be a fundamental mitzvah that is, like one of the more foundational ones. So, can I? Are you comfortable reading, Sarah? So I think I'm going to start with the sources, having everyone read. Like, if you're uncomfortable reading, then just pass it on to the next person. So we'll start with you, Sarah. Source A, which is Exodus chapter 20, verses 9 to 11.
Excuse me. Can you clarify, what bad things happened on the 9th of Av?
The 9th of Av was when Titus destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. This was in the year 70 AD. And that was the first, it was actually the second terrible thing that happened on that day, but it's the main one that we're commemorating. The root of the problem was something terrible that happened years earlier in the desert. And throughout the Jewish history, name a terrible thing that happened, and most often it will have been on the 9th of Av, including the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, which anyone on the Spain trip will learn much more about, and going on to many other expulsions that happened later on in history. And then some ghettos, the big ghettos, were liquidated on the during World War II on the 9th of Av. It's been a day that has just attracted terrible things. It's been bad news for the Jews for years. So that's what, just in short, whatever. Okay, Sarah?
Okay. You shall work during the 6 weekdays and do all your tasks, but the 7th day is Shabbat to the Lord your God. Do not do anything that constitutes work. This includes you, your son, your daughter, your servant, your maid, your animal, and foreigner in your gates. For it was during the 6 days, the weekdays, that God made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, that he rested on the 7th day. God therefore blessed the Shabbat and made it holy.
So we see that the Torah tells us not to do any work. So can I have any definitions of how you would describe work?
I define it as creating.
Cool. Anything else?
What you're paid to do.
What you're paid to do, like what you do between 9 and 5 or 5 a.m. and 10 p.m., whatever your workday is like, right? What your profession is. I mean, that's personally what I would pick for work. I mean, that's just colloquially what people mean when they say work. It's like what I do for work, like what I do for a living. This is obviously a problematic definition for Shabbat, which is probably why you said creative, because just imagine if you're a public speaker, so you have to stay really quiet on Shabbat, or if you're a politician, it's no lying on Shabbat, whatever. So it's a problematic and very subjective kind of definition for
Anything you don't want to do, I guess, right? Is there anything you are not wanting to oh, you know what, I have to do this. You don't say that about going to the movies or whatever. That's not
right.
That's not considered work because
and you find
it's anything you just want to do. Yeah.
Right. That's also subjective though, because you find that people who have a certain job won't enjoy doing it in their free time, and other people are like, oh my gosh, you're so lucky,
Yeah.
I love doing that. No, if you actually paid to do it, you would hate it. So that's a similar kind of thing. The good news is that, once again, that is just a loose translation of what the Torah says. So if we look in the Hebrew, and I put it in bold, the word is lo taseh, do not do, kol any melacha. So what you're not supposed to be doing is malacha. The translators, whoever they were, decided that since the word malacha is in Hebrew, we should find some English alternative, and they put the word work. So in order to get a better understanding of what we're supposed to be abstaining from on Shabbat, we should try to do some research after the word malacha. So if I remember correctly, Rabbi Garfinkel was saying that the way to do this is to just go to the first time it was actually, you were saying that, right? So go to the first time it appears in the Torah, and that is source B. Do you want to take it, Melissa?
Sure. And the heavens and the earth and all their hosts were completed. And God finished all the Malachah, and he had done on the seventh day. And he rested on the seventh day from all his Malachah and he had done. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, for he rested on Shabbat from all his Malachah that God created in order to do so.
So as you can see, first of all, the translator got this much, much better this time, and that's because I went in and edited it so that it would fit my class. So here actually the word is, you see the word melacha appearing again and again and again, and it's referring to what God did in the process of creating the world. So finally we're starting to get a little more of a working definition on what we're supposed to be abstaining from on Shabbat.
And that's the Smurf paragraph too.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So if there's any takeaway from tonight's class, in a few days we're going to have Shabbat, and everyone should do their best, each depending on where they're holding, not to create any galaxies or any planets, or right? Because whatever God did in the 7 days of creation, that is melacha, and that's what we're supposed to be abstaining from. So I think we're it's a little better now. It's like a slightly more workable definition. Maybe not for me personally. I never know what the secret lives of people around me in the room are actually leading. But it's still kind of difficult to apply into our personal lives. So the next best thing to do, we'll look for the next time the word malacha appears, and then hopefully that'll be somewhat workable, though it does need to be connected to this same definition of creation that God did during the 6 days of creation. So that brings us to source C, which is in Exodus chapter 31, verses 1 to 5, and we're going to see that same area of the Torah coming back again. So I just want to point it out. This is in Exodus chapter 31, and it's discussing the construction of the tabernacle. And the reason why I love that word is because it reminds me of Captain Haddock in Tintin. I don't know if anyone here read Tintin, but I always imagine Captain Haddock knocking his head on the doorway or something and saying, tabernacles, or I don't know what, that's just my own personal association. It's a somewhat meaningless word for me aside from that. So the tabernacle was a prefab version of the temple that the Jews created in the desert. So when they got to Israel, eventually they built the temple in Jerusalem. But while they were traveling the desert, God commanded them to build this Mishkan, this tabernacle. And what it was this version of the temple that they could assemble and take apart, hopefully with instructions that were better than the IKEA stuff that I buy. They seem to be doing a pretty good job at it many, many times, because every time they camped and they never built it, but they took it apart. So that is source C. Jason, anyone?
Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. I have filled him with a godly spirit, with wisdom, insight, and knowledge, and with every malachah to weave designs, to work with gold, silver, and copper, stone cutting for setting, and wood carving, to perform every malachah."
So now this is definitely much better, because this is something that a human being is doing, and it's getting the word malacha, so that's much easier to imitate. But it's still kind of arbitrary, it's random. Why is the Torah using this word over here and the same word in the creation of the world, and what's the connection, and how is this something that we can apply to Shabbat? So in order to do that, we should try to get a better understanding into what the Mishkan was, this prefab temple, and what the actual temple was in Jerusalem. And then hopefully that'll give us a little kind of a better understanding. So the first thought to think about is, why would there be a temple in the first place? We believe that the entire world is where God's presence is, and obviously, there's he doesn't need a home or anything. Like, what's the concept of having this designated place where that will be the place of, so to speak, God's dwelling, and that's where you go to kind of have that connection with God. God created the world. God is everywhere. So what's this concept of a temple? And the truth is that question is so good that originally there wasn't meant to be a temple. There wasn't meant to be this prefab Mishkan. None of it was supposed to be. The entire world was supposed to be this temple. And it was just after the sin of the golden calf in the desert where the world came to a situation where it needed this Mishkan. So what I mean, so if you think about the first thing that people do when they wake up. So the first thing that people say, the first thing that many people say is probably something I shouldn't repeat. But the next thing, at least if you are part of Project 613's mindfulness whole thing going on with the alarm clock, so the next thing is the words of Moda'ani, where we thank God for giving us another day and giving us our soul, and it's like a moment of appreciation as we start off the day with that kind of attitude. And then the next thing that you do, that a Jew is supposed to do, is supposed to wash his hands. And you're supposed to wash your hands a special way with a cup, and that is reminiscent of what the priest would do when he would walk into the temple. As he's walking into the temple, he's about to start his service, and the first thing he does is wash his hand, and that is also what we're supposed to do in the morning as we start our day, which is supposed to symbolize that same kind of thing where the world that we're about to enter and the things that we're about to do is all part of a higher purpose, and it's part of our connection with God and serving God. So that is part of that same idea. Really, the entire world is supposed to be a temple. The reason why we have this one designated, at least we had this one designated spot, was because after the sin of the golden calf, God saw that the system wasn't working. We weren't really able to focus directly on God in the world. We were getting distracted. There were things that were tempting us, like the golden calf. And God said, okay, this isn't working. There are too many distractions. We're going to create this one place, this one geographical place where there won't be anything, no distractions, nothing. You're going to leave your phone behind, leave your jobs behind, everything. You will come there, you'll focus entirely on me, and then when it's too much for you and you're starting to get a little ADD about it, walk out and go on with the rest of your life. Obviously, you're supposed to try to incorporate God into the rest of your life, but to have that full focus like we were supposed to have in our everyday life, that was just designated for the temple. So, that is why we see in source D, which is the Seforno, Rabbi Avadia Seforno, who lived in Italy between 1480 and 1550, and I remember that off by heart because I have a little footnote on the bottom. You can see it on your sheets also. So that's source D. Do you want to read it, Anna?
Sure. And so you should do, in order that I dwell amongst you to speak with you and to accept the prayers and the service of Israel, not as was the case prior to the sin of the golden calf, etc.
Right, so you see that same concept where the entire construction of the Mishkan, of this prefab temple, was only as like a backup plan now that there was this sin and the Jewish people weren't able to have a direct and totally focused relationship with God. They were looking for intermediaries and different things. Fine. And so if you think about that, so we were supposed to have the entire world being the temple, this place of focus on God, and instead we're creating this small place to represent that in small, to be more confined geographically. So if you take a look at source E, which is a medrash, Sharon?
Rabbi Yaakov, the son of Rabbi Yassi, said what is meant by the expression, O Lord, I love the dwelling of your house, i.e. the world, and the place of the residence, the Mishkan of your glory. It means that the Mishkan is on par with the creation of the world.
Right. So what we were actually doing in essence was we were trying to create a miniature version of the entire world, and that is what the Mishkan was supposed to be. So there are several Torah portions that discuss the construction of the Mishkan, and the Torah goes into great detail on how many centimeters each thing was and how many feet and what it was exactly made of. And most of us are reading through, it's like, okay, like this is pretty boring. But Kabbalists are having a field day. It's like, unbelievable. And the reason is because what we're actually doing is the construction of the Mishkan was constructing like a miniature version of the entire world. And every single measurement represents an understanding of how the world is created, how the world runs. growing up in Israel, I lived in a little suburb of Jerusalem called Telstone. And a few minutes from my house, there was a new tourist attraction that opened up, which was just genius. And it was called Mini Israel. Have you ever been there? And Israel has a very terrible infrastructure problem. There's always traffic, and it costs a lot of money to solve the traffic issue. So instead, what they did, I mean, this is my theory, they just put all the tourist attractions of Israel in one place. This was before they could just do it with virtual reality, so they had to actually build every single thing. And you would just walk around, and there would be the Western Wall, and all you had to do is take 3 steps, and there was Masada, or I don't know, you're taking a hike up north suddenly, or down south, whatever it is. It's all, I mean, it's a small country to start with, but this is also there's only one entrance fee, which Israelis love. It's I don't get and I used to love just walking around there and seeing everything, especially when you're small. It's actually closer to you can actually see everything. And that is exactly what the Mishkan was from a Kabbalist point of view. You'd walk in, and this was the galaxies and the entire world and how everything was run, definitely from a spiritual point of view. And that is why, if you look in source F, which is Talmud Bavli, we are by, anyone want to read it? No, Rachel?
Okay. Rabbi Yehuda said, in the name of Rab, Bezalel knew how to combine the letters with which heaven and earth were created.
Right, so Kabbalistically speaking, the world was created using the Hebrew alphabet and using the Torah. And Bezalel, who was the chief architect of the Mishkan, in order to construct the Mishkan, what he needed, his degree in engineering or architecture, was actually understanding the combinations of the spiritual powers of all the different letters of how the world was created. Understanding how the world was created was what you needed as an engineer to construct the Mishkan. So what we basically have in the Mishkan is taking what God did when he constructed the world and translating it into human terms. So, obviously, human beings cannot possibly create planets or star systems or whatever. But what they can do is build this Mishkan, even though we don't know exactly how to do it ourselves. This is the translation into human terms of that kind of construction. So, we're going to take a look at source G, and I want everyone to listen to it critically. And then I want to hear opinions on what is wrong with this verse and how it could have been written better were you writing it. So Camilla, do you want to read or pass on?
And God spoke to Moshe, saying, You shall speak to the children of Israel, saying, However, you must observe my Sabbaths, for it's a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am God who sacrifices you.
Who sanctifies?
Sorry.
Very nice. So, any thoughts on what? Any thoughts on
Well, just off the bat, if I'm somebody who's looking to observe Shabbat, and well, God told me I can just do it however I want to do it. Then it's not very specific. If he says, however you must observe my
right.
However. Oh well, I guess I read it wrong, but it says, however you must. I don't know. It's not specific. So it kind of.
Okay, so it's extremely vague. It's missing all the details.
What
Okay,
about it?
do it.
Yeah.
But then okay, just tell me how. Very good. Okay. Anything else? I'll read it again, and I'll put a little bit of an emphasis. And God spoke to Moshe, not that you didn't do a great job, Kamal. And God spoke to Moshe, saying, And you shall speak to the children of Israel, saying, However, you must observe my Sabbaths, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations. So what is strange about this verse? Yeah? What?
I was going to say the word however.
Excellent. However, yes, you want to head to the beach. However, don't, because there might be an elevator at the, whatever. So what is this word however doing here? Why however? Just say whatever. We're not don't be so nervous with us. Just say, okay, like this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do, and we'll do it. Like, fine. So what's however? So as I said, it's important to see where this verse is. This is Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 to 14. So if we take a look in our earlier sources, we can see source C, where Betzalel was constructing the Mishkan, was in Exodus 31, verses 1 to 5.
Is it 31 or 35? Is that a miss? Is it typo?
What? Sorry?
Well, here it says 35, but is it actually 31?
It's 31. Sorry about that.
Okay.
It's 31, chapter 31, verses 1 to 5. So then you just skip a few verses later, right? So that's talking about the construction of the Mishkan, of this prefab temple. And then a few verses later, suddenly Hashem says, 1 second, okay, we just spoke at length about the measurements and how you're going to build it and what you're going to do. However, you must observe the Sabbath. And now that suddenly makes sense. This is totally out of place. Like, what's it doing here? And what we see is God saying it's extremely important to build the temple, however, observe the Sabbath. So Rashi is always going to be sensitive to anything that's like a little bit funny in the verse. And that is source H. Do we have a volunteer for reading source H?
Although I ordered you to command them to take part in the malacha of the tabernacle, do not think that you may suspend the observance of Shabbat by laboring on Shabbat because of that particular task. However, you shall observe my Shabbat. Even though you will be extremely diligent in the malacha of building the tabernacle, do not suspend Shabbat on account of it, for the term comes to exclude performing work on the tabernacle on Shabbat.
So the word ach that you just read beautifully was the word in Hebrew for however. So that's all he's just saying. So now it suddenly makes sense. God was talking about the construction of the temple and about this Mishkan, this tabernacle, and he says, however, even though it's extremely important what you're doing and all the things that you're doing now are like creating the entire universe, however, these are things that you may not do on Shabbat. So, and if we think about it, that makes a lot of sense because we spoke about how the melacha that we're not supposed to be doing on Shabbat is really supposed to be imitating God who abstained from creating the world. And then we translated that into human terms, us creating this Mishkan, this prefab temple, and that is where Hashem says, okay, you finally got it. You got a great definition. What you're doing now is what you should not be doing on Shabbat. So take a look at source I, which is the Malbim, who just spells this out beautifully. No pressure, anyone? No.
By saying that work on those activities involved in the construction of the tabernacle must cease on Shabbat, the Torah implies that any activity involved in the construction of the tabernacle is considered melacha.
Beautiful. So this is the working definition for what we're supposed to be abstaining from on Shabbat. This is the human translation of this word melacha that Hashem told us in the Ten Commandments to not be doing on Shabbat. And the oral Torah from Sinai has this separated into 39 specific categories of just taking the entire work of constructing the Mishkan, this prefab temple. It's divided into 39 categories, and then everything that we do today as Shabbos observant Jews is basically aligned to one of those 39 categories. And there'll be things that were done in the entire process of building the temple, from preparing the different plants and stuff that they use for the construction and the wood, to weaving the different stuff of the curtains and the different, like every single aspect of the construction is defined into one of these 39 melachot, as they're called. It's the same word, melacha. So the categories of things we abstain from on Shabbat are called melachot, and those are basically timeless things, which are like categories of work, which are every generation defined into basically things that are part of the same concept but translated into modern day times. So for example, the elevator button that I was pushing, so really there's nothing wrong with the elevator. The only problem is as you push that button, you are closing an electrical circuit. And when electricity first came out, the rabbis, every generation when there's something new that comes out, the rabbis say, okay, how do we define this action and what category is it included in? And they look at the 39. If it is something that is not included in any of the 39, they say, okay, fine. But if they say, wait a minute, what you're actually doing here is exactly like one of those actions, then it gets considered a melacha. So people assume that, when electricity came, the rabbis realized this was going to be extremely distracting because they were going to be inventing cell phones, and then the rabbi said, okay, new rule, no cell phones on Shabbat. But that's not what happened. It doesn't work that way. All the rabbis can do is say, okay, let's analyze this from a technical point of view, from a scientific point of view, and then see if this falls into any of the pre-existing categories of one of the 39 malachot. As a matter of fact, when electricity first came out, the rabbis could never have imagined that it would become something distracting. All it was turning on a light bulb or something like that, which is great for Shabbos observance. But the rabbis first analyzed it and said, wait a minute, this is included in the melacha of, there was actually an argument between the rabbis, though all the rabbis at the time agreed that it was one of the melachot. There was just an argument about which one specifically. There were two options. But it's either considered creating something because you are creating an electrical circuit, or the energy of the fire the energy of the electricity is considered like igniting a fire. So that's just like an example of how this system works of the 39 malachot. But there's no leeway for the rabbis at the time to say, okay, this is bad, so let's just throw it in there with the group. So I'm just going to finish off with source J, which is Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who basically gives it a more easy to understand definition. I'll read this one. The word melacha appears 200 times in Scripture and never once refers to physical labor. The melacha, which is forbidden on Shabbat, is conceived as the execution of an intelligent purpose by the practical skill of man. Any production, creation, or transforming of an object for human purposes, but not physical exertion. So that original definition that we had for the word work, which you said was creative acts, that was pretty good. Even though I think the translation was terrible, you actually had a great working translation. So the execution of an intelligent purpose by the practical skill of man. Whenever I take my son in an elevator, I always try to imagine what it looks like to him. You walk into this box, and the door closes, and then a few seconds later it opens, and there's an entire new world at the other end. And really all it is just a box, and then you press that button and it gives it this entire intelligent purpose based on the creation of man. And that's true also with the box of metal and plastic that I cherish outside over there with my Mac, which is really nothing but some wires and plastic and metal. And a very fashionable Apple symbol. But then you press that button, you turn it on, and that is that intelligent purpose. And this ties into an amazing story that I heard about someone I know who, for convenience, we'll call Dan. And Dan's wife went into labor, and she was about to give birth to their first son. It was a beautiful moment for Dan, who was usually very careful about the speed limit, which is why he was always waiting for his wife to go into labor so that he could be the hero, speeding down the street, rushing her to the hospital. And they got to the hospital, thank God, in time, and the wife gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. And just about, I would say, 20 seconds after the baby came out, this wife turns to her husband and says, Dan, you were amazing. And she was referring to the actual labor process, not the driving, which freaked her out. And what basically she was trying to do is she was tapping into the male problem of being near your wife in labor, which is that as a man you want to fix the problem, but when your wife's in labor, throwing Tylenols at her won't help, and really the only thing you can do to help is just take a few steps back and stay there until the baby comes out. And that's a very rough experience for a husband. There's the famous story about the guy who was waiting outside the labor room, and the midwife came out and said, Mazel tov, you had a baby girl. And the guy's like, oh, amazing. It's like, why, you always want a baby girl? And he's like, no, I just don't want her to need to go through what I just went. Waiting outside the labor room. Okay, a terrible joke. But so she wanted to make her husband feel good. So she said, you were really amazing at standing there on the side, doing nothing. And can you just imagine for a second if this Dan walks out of there thinking, you know what, she's right. That was really, look at that baby. Oh my gosh, that was amazing. And the pushing and everything, that was me. Wow, I'm awesome, I'm great. So even though the wife was trying to make him feel good, it's very important for Dan to understand where his place was in things and have actual appreciation for what his wife did in that birthing experience. And that is basically the idea of Shabbos, because when we run around the world during the 6 days of creation, we constantly are doing all these creative activities and we think we're so awesome and so amazing and we're really running the entire world. And God says, okay, it's very important for you to think, lots of great things about yourself, but if you're going to really finish your day or finish your week thinking that you are actually the creator of the world and you're running the place, you will never be able to have a relationship with me, because you won't appreciate my part in things. You won't appreciate what I'm doing the entire time and how I'm actually there behind the scenes with the marionette strings. So in order to have that relationship with us, God says, okay, 1 day a week, you're going to stop creating entirely. Your entire process of walking around doing the human translation of creation, you will not do on Shabbat, and that's when you'll be able to really focus on my relationship with you and my part in the world, which ties us right back into this question before we finish. Why is it that on the 9th of Av, even though it's an extremely serious fast day, we ignore the 9th of Av and we celebrate Shabbat? And the reason is very simply because it's extremely tragic that we lost the temple, that place that God designated for us to have that intense relationship with Him. But we only lost it as a place geographically. But in time, meaning it doesn't exist in space, but in time, that still exists, and that is what Shabbos is. On Shabbos, we don't have a geographical location, we have a point in time that is entirely focused on our relationship with God with none of our distractions around. And since that is what's going on Shabbat, there is no reason, it doesn't make sense to focus on the destruction of the temple, because it actually, in a way, is there. That relationship that it was all about, it never was about the walls that were destroyed. We're mourning the opportunity that was lost for that relationship with God, and in a way, not to the same extent, but in a very strong way, we have that while we are celebrating Shabbos. So that is what Shabbat is all about, and I'd like to finish off by extending a very personal invitation for Shabbos. I know this week is the Big Shabbaton, but any week we are hosting, Rabbi Garfinkel's hosting. My wife is a great cook, and she gives me tons of compliments on her cooking, but I know it's actually her, and I just stand there on the side and do as if I'm helping and supervise. I'm not sure if you should tell her that I told this story about Dan, because it wasn't really Dan. Anyways, thank you very much, and everyone's invited.